There were really quite a few folks who were on the trip who are in this room now. And the goal of this event is to hear from them, to get their perspectives of what they learned, what they took back from the trip, and how that might apply to our system here in Massachusetts. So first, I'm just going to give just a little bit of background and context for the trip. So first of all, emerging adult justice. I've been working in the justice world now for a number of decades. This is a relatively new field. What we're talking about here is folks between the ages, basically between ages 18 and 25. Historically, in the United States and in Massachusetts, but at every state, when you're 18, you reach your 18th birthday, you're automatically treated as an adult in the criminal justice world, right? You're going to be prosecuted as an adult, and you're going to be sanctioned as an adult, and no exceptions. There are a number of exceptions, however, for people younger than 18. Every state has some capacity to try and or sanction children as adults in the criminal justice system. So in Massachusetts, we started age 14 is an age when you could end up with an adult sentence. But there's been some very interesting research in the last few decades on this age group. And what it turns out is that there's actually quite a long transitional period between childhood, when you're dependent on folks financially, practically, emotionally, and true independent adulthood. And for anybody who's had children, it's amazing how long this process can actually take. And so the fields that the research is really focused on is neurobiology, developmental psychology, and sociology. And the bottom line is that there is no magic birthday. Turns out you just don't become an adult because you turned 18. And so this slide just sort of tries to capture some of them. We'll go into detail, but how, especially the bottom words, right, is that we know that young people are really high prone to peer pressure. They tend to be very impulsive. They're risk takers, right? And then on the other side, the sort of pro-social factors, the things that help kids grow up to be healthy and engaged adults, right? And that requires actually just time and opportunity, among other things, right? It doesn't happen unless you kind of go through the process. And one of the things that I think is important here is that the research indicates that this is actually a distinct developmental stage. You know, we think about childhood, we think about, oh, you know, my child's a toddler. Oh, my child's, you know, an elementary school age. My child's an adolescence. Adolescence is extended, it's prolonged. It goes into your mid-20s with sort of dramatic changes. And in fact, the sociology research indicates that, in fact, this whole transition period is become longer, it takes longer in this generation than it has in past generations. So this all raises an important question, right? If we have a distinct developmental stage and a critically important developmental stage, should our justice system recognize that, right? Should we be responding in any particular ways that would make things helpful? So I'm just going to briefly talk about emerging adults now in our justice system, right? So they are in the adult system. They are disproportionately represented in our criminal justice system. 10% of the population, interesting, Massachusetts numbers and national numbers pretty much identical, but they constitute 29% of folks who are arrested, and 21 US and 23% Massachusetts for those who are incarcerated. So we've got more of them than we would think we should. And again, that's partly the developmental risk factors. We also, though, this striking is the poor outcomes, right? They have the highest recidivism rates of any age group. And you're talking about 3 out of 4, so call it sort of failure rate, right? You're reconvicted within 3 years of the time in which you might be released from incarceration. So those are, kind of startling numbers. You also, I think, is important to recognize the really stark and troubling racial disparities, right? In the national numbers, these are for Massachusetts, I mean, the data speaks for itself, but Massachusetts, the 18 and 19-year-olds in particular are 8 to 9 times more likely to be caught up and incarcerated in our criminal justice system than Caucasian. So it is very, very startling. More bad news, and again, this is relates, we've got an issue brief on this. This is an age group where they're not just vulnerable for, being sucked into our justice system, they're also very vulnerable to substance use disorder, right? And again, you can see the connections, and of course, there's a connection to if you're involved in substances, you also more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. And if you look at this, this is sort of an interesting chart, because what it shows you is that you're really at your peak of sort of engaging in sort of drug abuse violations is exactly this sort of 18, 19, 20-year-old population. And in Massachusetts, a quarter of all arrests of 18 and 19-year-olds are substance related. 2/3 of adults in treatment for opiate addiction started opiates before age 25, right? So you're just sort of filling in this picture. And then really high rates of mortality among anybody who's been incarcerated when they're released for opiate overdoses, but particularly, again, this age group, they have the highest rates. So before I just go into complete depression, there's actually some good news too. And that is the sort of the universal crime curve, is we know that actually most folks will age out of crime. That is very good news. We also know that adolescence can be a very tricky time, a very challenging time, and a bit of a heartache for people trying to raise adolescents. But the flip side is true, is that as they are very vulnerable to things like peer pressure in the negative, they're also really vulnerable to peer pressure in the positive, right? And that they're very malleable, their brains are malleable, they're developing, they're bringing in new information within their environment. My classic example, I think of this, is you think of a late teen who's struggling in life, and you think people pulling out their hair, and then they switch schools, and suddenly they seem to blossom. Now, some of it may be that the school is engaging them and supporting them, and it may also be a new social setting, right, where they have new peers and they're being stretched in positive ways. So I think that's very important to think about. And thinking about interventions, we know that there are a number of interventions that are effective, right? It's not like the research is blank on this. But I think what is important to note is that not all of these are available in the adult system, or most of them are not available or not as robust as they would be in the juvenile system. And there's also the issue of when it's not only what you can provide in the juvenile system, but also what do you provide in the adult system, and to what degree do you want to make sure you minimize any kind of trauma, and also provide opportunities, right? And we know that if they can naturally grow out, we also need to provide them some opportunities to do that. So as a matter of for Massachusetts and for the country, there's been talk about this is growing recognition, right? That what we're doing isn't very effective, right? With really, really pathetic outcomes. Should we try something else? If we tried, could it really get any worse than what we're doing? And it has sort of, this recognition has caused an incredible explosion of experimentation reforms around the country. So I've been in this position for less than 2 years. I cannot keep up with the number of new things happening in around different states. So here's just a quick list, right? We have specialized courts, we have specialized caseloads just for this age group. Specialized correctional units. We have one that just opened up in Middlesex County. Sheriff, I think, Tompkins will talk about his plans in Suffolk County. We have specialized parole in things like California. We have hybrid systems. And we have 4 states in 2018 that had active legislation to raise the age of juvenile jurisdiction to incorporate some emerging adults into their juvenile system. And as you know, Massachusetts is debated it, Illinois, Connecticut, and Vermont. So a relatively new concept here in the US, not a new concept in the world, and in particularly in Europe. So what you find in Europe is that 28 of 35 countries have some special laws or protections for this age group in their justice system, right? So the vast majority have it. One of those countries, Germany, really stands out. Back in 1953, Germany expanded their youth system to include 18, 19, 20-year-olds. So any 18, 19, 20-year-old accused of a crime, it want to go to youth court. And they can be sanctioned under the juvenile system. And in fact, what you find is the vast majority are sanctioned under the juvenile system, and particularly for the more serious crimes. The kinds of cases that end up in the adult system are things that are more likely to be motor vehicle offenses, where it's sort of a quick fine, more efficient, so they have them in the adult system. But things like rape and murder, so the more serious cases, those are the ones actually they retain. I think it's also important to note that in Germany, they don't have exceptions under 18. Until your 18th birthday, you are a juvenile. There's no fast track to an adult system. They really see that as distinct. You're going to stay in the youth system. And they also don't start their system to the 14th birthday, right? So that's another thing. So they've sort of, they've changed the spectrum in which the youth system looks. So really looking at adolescence, and late adolescence and early adulthood. The trip was fantastic. This is us in a court, youth court in Berlin. There are a couple of members missing. They were off at some hallway and we were trying to find them. So I apologize for them missing.
The rest of the place is as much of a maze as this looks.
Yeah, exactly. It was definitely a maze. But we thought that the Justice Lab thought, it's really worth a visit. Let's roll up our sleeves, just go look at it. Let's ask tons of questions. Let's dig in and see what they've been doing all these decades and how does it work and what lessons can we learn. It was an absolute honor to be with this group. It was super diverse in terms of prosecutors, defense, everybody in the different systems. We're going to start with a panel discussion with Chief Justice Paula Carey, Department of Youth Services Commissioner Peter Forbes, and Suffolk Sheriff Steve Tompkins. But again, there are other people in this room. We just can't have a panel of 20. And so we're going to call on them to have them share their experience as well. To lead us in this discussion, I introduce my colleague, Vinny Schiraldi, who's co-director of the Justice Lab at Columbia University. And his background was particularly important, I think, and helpful and useful on this trip, because he's had extensive experience looking at systemic reform in the justice system from the outside, but he's also had to actually implement and practice on the inside, and he's run 2 major components of the justice system. He was head of juvenile corrections in Washington, D.C., and he was also head of the probation department for New York City. That included both juveniles and adults, right? So these were his population in whatever way, that state put those people in whatever bucket. So so I'll leave to that, and then if you want, we can show a few pictures of Germany now or later.
I think we're tied up time, so let's
go.
You can.
I'll flip later, maybe as time goes on. But good morning, everyone. How are you?
Good morning.
I'm going to make 4 quick points before I turn it over to the experts that joined us on this trip, both the ones on the panel and the ones sitting in the audience. One point is where Leah left off. I felt like the 22 people that came to Germany they left whatever their agendas were, they left them at the door. It was incredibly intellectually honest, open-minded, curious, smart, and decent group of people. And even though it's clear that everything in Germany is not analogous to everything in the U.S., folks got past that and were able to say, all right, what are we able to take from this that might help us, and what do we not want to take from this? And that's totally fine. It was an educational trip. It wasn't a force-feeding trip. 2, the timing would just work out dumb luck-wise to be incredible. Literally, the conference committee announced their legislation, and then the next day, members of that committee and the whole group were on a plane to Germany, and then 2 days after we returned, the really watershed criminal justice reform legislation got voted on by the full legislature. So the policy relevance crackled during the trip. 3 is that it's a still live conversation in the legislation. Several components passed that affected directly this group. Money was put in, and if I'm wrong, there are more experts in the room, to look at possibly having special units in houses of corrections, special court parts, and the courts had already announced that their intention was to innovate in this area, special probation caseload. And there was a task force established to look at emerging adult justice, including whether it's a good idea to do what Germany did. So that was
We
great.
did everything but give them money, actually.
You didn't give them money?
The money will be in the
We'll be
budget.
taking contributions on the way out.
Money's in the budget.
Cool.
We'll
That's
work
great.
on that direction.
And then 4th is, we're not done. We're not done because of what the legislature did and what the policy discussion will be, but Columbia is not done either. We're going to be holding a series of events sort of like this that just keep this issue alive and keep discussing it and keep the energy that I think we all felt from the Germany trip relevant and alive. So those are my 4 points. I'm going to go from my left to your right. I'm sorry, my left to my right, that is, and start with Sheriff Tompkins. Sheriff, and then what I'm going to do is sort of, people said things on the trip, I'm going to kind of amplify those things and have them respond to that, but also say anything else you want that you feel is relevant. Sheriff Tompkins, 2 things that came from you that I found super interesting. One was you had a very strong reaction to the people on the trip and the delegation. I'd like you to say a little about that if you could, and also how the Germans conceptualized and dealt with this population of young people as different from the way you felt the U.S. did. So I'll turn it over to you.
Well, first, I want to thank everybody for coming this morning. I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak. And before I get to those comments, I do have something relevant to say, and it speaks to what Senator Brownsberger just said about more money being in the budget. Thank you, Senator. We need it. Looking forward to it. I'll tell all of my folks it's coming.
I should say to the extent there's more money, it's in the budget.
No, don't tease. I'm serious. Anyway, the makeup of the group that went over, I found fascinating, because generally when you go on these kind of excursions, it's of like mind and of like industry. And on this trip, we had judges, we had DYS, we had legislators, we had district attorneys, prosecutors, we had people from the social service agencies. Equally as important, we have legislators. And that was very important because after we left whatever site we were at, we actually had time to sit and talk about what it is that we just seen, what it was that we just learned, and how we can work as a collaborative to move this initiative forward. And the initiative I'm talking about particularly here is keeping more of our citizens out of jail and looking at what it means to raise the age. And so I thought the makeup of that group was crucially important. And these are people, most of us knew each other anyway, but the fact that we had a chance, I think it was a week or so, to really sit with each other on a day in, day out basis and share some meals and talk about what it is that we just experienced, I think was enriching. To your second point, what I found over in Europe, and I was actually in the UK prior to going to the Germany trip to look at some facilities there, is that in Europe, there's more of a compassionate approach, I do believe, to incarceration. Insofar as these are people that for the most part are going to go home. And so the question then becomes, how do you take care of them while they're incarcerated? And how do you help them improve their station in life so that they don't recidivate and don't come back? And I think that their approach was really spot I'm not, when you juxtapose it to what goes on in America, I think we're a little more, we're a little tougher, a little more penal, I do believe, than what we found in Europe. And so that was refreshing. The trick here now is to go back and talk to, in my world, say, people in corrections, to say, we just found some new things that we like, that we think can make work. But in a quasi-militaristic environment like mine, that old adage, well, we've never done it that way, applies. And so it's a little hard to change thoughts and perceptions around, but I think we can get it done.
Thank you very much, Sheriff. Judge Carey, one of the things I remember you talking about is how judges need options, and that in Germany for this young adult population, they had an option that you don't have. And I'd like you to talk a little about that, and also you mentioned about how the attitudes and approaches to this age group differ than ours, and I just sort of love you to say what you think about that, but also anything else.
Great, thank you. It was a terrific trip. I was really getting back feeling very invigorated about first of all, our system. I think, it's a true credit to Peter in his work. I think it left me thinking, at least for those folks under the age of 18, we do a really good job, or under the age of 19, we do a good job in our system, which doesn't mean we can't do better, but I felt proud of Massachusetts in terms of the kinds of things that we do. But as far as options are concerned, because I'm always thinking of our system and the way our system is structured, and trying to figure out resources, because I'm responsible for the resources of my judges and how many judges I have. And what I was fascinated by is that, at least in Germany, the judges had an option. When they had someone before them, they could decide whether they were going to apply juvenile law or adult law. And concurrent with that, they could also decide, am I going to sentence this young person under juvenile law to a juvenile facility or to an adult facility? And invariably, and I think we saw the data, it was 70+% were actually sentenced in the juvenile area. And in the more serious crimes, over 90%. So I found that really striking. And
because that was a judicial decision.
That was a judicial decision, although it's a very different system, first of all. But I do think, despite the differences, not only in the system itself, but also in the society. I mean, they don't have that much gun crime, frankly, which is very different from our system. And opioids don't appear to be an issue there. So that presents it being very different than our society and the kinds of things that we are grappling with. But notwithstanding that, I still think that there's so much we can learn from Germany in terms of the way in which they've approached their citizens. I mean, and it's also worth noting that it took from the 1950s to now to get it up to the 75%. It didn't start off that way. So this was an evolution for their system. So we're sort of, many, many years behind them, I would say, at this point. But I think we can pull a lot from Germany and the way in which that they address individuals. The other piece is the constitutional protections. The trial that we watched, this young person did not have a lawyer. Although I think they make a decision that if there's a risk of incarceration that they would have a lawyer. But it struck me that this person was really sitting by himself and had very little sort of guidance. And the judge did pretty much all of the questioning. The only thing the prosecutor did was really make a statement. There was a bit of a language barrier, but we did have someone who was interpreting sort of ad hoc for us, so we had some knowledge of what was actually being said. And the sentencing there, you can't get a sentence over 10 years. And we heard from a prosecutor about a very serious crime, a homicide, where a young person actually stomped his grandmother to death, and he got a 6-year sentence. So it's a very different view of brain development. It was very intriguing. And the other piece that I found interesting, not only from the perspective of who do we have in our houses of correction and DOC, but what are my court officers in terms of what kinds of training do we have for court officers? are 2 years. They have 2 years of intensive training, and it's not just corrections that they train these folks in. They train them in brain development. They almost train them in sort of social work. And they view themselves, these are the quote corrections officers in the prisons, and they view themselves very differently. And the ratios of prison guards to the population was so off the chart. There was a young mothers unit in the prison that we went in northern Germany, and the ratio in that unit, the mothers actually had their children with them, and the ratio in that unit was 1-to-1.
And the mothers were like 18, 19-year-old.
Right, and the young boy, I think, was 4.
Yeah.
Was he 3?
Yeah.
And it was an infant, and it looked like it was the nursery looked like something any of the people in this room, certainly something I would have decorated, just like it. It was beautiful. In fact, I made someone take a picture of a mobile that one of the young mothers had done. I said, you could sell this. This is really was awesome. And she had made it. So it was fascinating because I think and I had asked one of the mothers, where would you be but for being here? And they considered it a gift because they actually had someone who was teaching them how to be a mother. So it's just a very different mindset.
I was looking to see if you had a picture of it up there, but we don't. That was striking.
That and I mean, just I mean, they were welding, they had woodworking that they were doing, and they had actual weapons, things that could be used as a weapon, and it wasn't considered, they didn't consider it a danger in any way, shape, or form. Yeah, and then the farm. The other piece is that I kept asking the question about the 14-year-olds and how wouldn't you, don't you think you need to separate someone who's 21 or 22 years old from someone who's much younger? Because that's one of the arguments that we always talk about, certainly in Massachusetts. And they really looked at me very quizzically and couldn't understand why I was even asking the question, because they didn't consider it an issue or a problem. Granted, we didn't see very many people who are under the age of 18 there. Although I think there was one person who was maybe 16. And the answer I got was that we just keep an eye on it. We just keep an eye on that person. So it wasn't considered an issue of putting people that are much younger in with people who were, 21, 22 years old.
We got 2 different bits of data from them on it, but it looked like somewhere around 85% of them were 18 or older, and that it was really more of a young adult facility with a handful of juveniles in it from that perspective, rather than the other way around. Thank you for that. Commissioner Forbes, we took a remarkable tour of your Middletown facility yesterday, which is just 2 or 3 years old. My view of it was it easily stacks up to some of the stuff we saw in Germany, and certainly was way better than their Berlin facility. And I have a million questions that came out of my mind on that. Then there was Sheriff Tompkins was there, Police Chief Brian Keyes from Chelsea was there, and a bunch of other folks that came on the Germany trip. But I want to ask you a million questions. I'll just hit you with sort of 3 points. One is, was there stuff in Germany you saw that from your many years as a juvenile justice professional made you think, I can push the envelope in these spaces? You got a bunch of 18 to 20-year-olds now. It's not like this is a new beast for you. There are kids that stay all the way up to their 21st birthday in your custody. I think many people don't know that. I'd like you to say kind of what do you do with them now, and maybe talk a little bit about YES program where they can stay on voluntarily. But also, if the legislature decided to raise the age to 18, 19, 20, to include those, what would you do? How would that play itself out in your world?
That's a big question.
It's a bunch of questions. So, I want to stand up here.
So, Sheriff Tompkins and Chief Carey covered some of what I would have said. I think that there are a couple things that I walked away from saying I want one of those. And one was really the vote piece. And it wasn't just that they had some really nice shops, and the guys that I saw, young guys, were in the shops, and they were focused, and it was very clear that they were, getting business done. It wasn't like busy time, but they were really doing stuff. But they had, from what I can understand, they had this vote training, apprenticeship, job placement process. And they talked about zero unemployment or 100% employment, depending upon how they framed it. So the idea is these guys would get certified and then go into the workforce with a legitimate vote certificate that would guarantee them a living wage. And that is like way beyond what we're doing at the Department of Youth Services in Massachusetts. We have little pockets of vote training that go on, but not something that's really developed like that. And they had the benefit, the two facilities that we were in, if I understood correctly, one was like 117 people in there the day we were there, and the other in Berlin was like 300. So they're doing big scale, so they can do the vote shops, and there were a number of things that I would really, love to have. They have big footprints, so it was like college campus scale, maybe not style, but scale, if you can think about that. Whereas our facilities in Massachusetts are really on postage stamps. We're on a couple of acres squeezed in a lot of places. We don't have a lot of land. Let's say that. We're running much smaller programs. The other piece, and it goes to, I think, a little bit of what Judge Carey started talking about, that stood out to me as something that we should be thinking about, was the security issue. And if anybody saw 60 Minutes several months ago, where the lifers had keys to their rooms, that was done out of an analysis they did on correctional officers' time, and that the correctional officers were spending a lot of their daily time opening doors for inmates to get their stuff out of their rooms. So they wound up giving the guys their keys. And we were on the third floor of the substance abuse program, and I was curious about that issue. Because it was like, God, how would you do that? Actually give them keys. The kids had keys on the third floor of that substance abuse unit, and they could key their door and get in. But once they're in at night, they're locked in, they can't get out. So that, with the tools in the vote shop, I left that. So they had a whole rack of tools, and the kids could access the tools and do their business and put the tool back up. And I just, like, we were in the dining area at one point. There were 4 or 5 young guys that walked past us, and there was no correctional officer or guard with them. So they're on like a campus. It's a correctional campus. They can't leave, but nobody's breathing down their neck. They're doing a transition. And so, like, the security piece, the way they have, there's more trust, I guess, than what we give out from a control standpoint. And I think that would probably carry to the sheriff's departments too. So it's like, for me, that was like, that's a different normal. And not that we have to do that, but it was a good example of us rethinking of what we actually do. Like, get out of your lane for a minute and try to think about how we're doing stuff, and what are the things that we're doing. We're doing them because we've always done them, versus things that we could actually, come off the highway, do some planning, and reboot. So I could go on and on. I think, on the 18 to 20-year-olds, we actually have, and most of the people up in the room understand this, in 1996, Massachusetts passed the youthful offender legislation. So we've had 18, 19, and 20-year-old individuals for the past 22 years or whatever, and we had a small pocket of over 18 before that law change. So we've been working with 18, 19, and 20-year-olds for quite a while. We currently have about 130 or 140 on our caseload. Additionally, we have a voluntary services program where we offer voluntary services. We offer voluntary services at the point of discharge to every single kid. It's something we've been doing strategically for the past several years. And right now, we have a group of about 140 average daily that are 18, 19, and 20. And so we have 2 pockets, maybe 250 18, 19, and 20-year-olds that we're working with. Some of them are on committed status, and some of them are on voluntary status, very different. But the program piece, you kind of aim it in the same direction. And one of the things, my time's up, let me know.
No.
One of the things that was going on for me in Germany was, we struggle with this, so it's kind of a healthy tension, which is, where does education sit and where does employment sit with your group? So if you're working under 18, it's really always, for us, it's always been about education. But you get to 18, 19, and 20, you really got to get the vote, and you got to get to employment and meaningful placement in the community for jobs. So they were really, from where I understood what's going on, they were much more advanced than we are on vote training, apprenticeship, and job placement. And I would just say parochially that we have a stronger educational program in our system, at least here in Massachusetts. That's our strength. So that's something that the 18, 19, and 20s have pushed us in one. I'll give you an example of that. So you wind up with this dilemma at DYS in Massachusetts. Well, we've worked through a lot of it, but what do you do with the 18-year-old that's got a high school diploma or their high set, and they're still in a secure situation? What do you do during the day? Can't let them sit around. So you have to have, and so we really have, we have a partnership with Bunker Hill and Springfield Technical Community College, and I believe Bristol, where the guys that have got their high school diploma and high set, they're able to take online courses, and we're trying to translate that. And this school year, we've had about 50 young people involved in post-secondary education that are committed to the Department of Services. So that's a big number for us. It's much bigger than it would have been 3 or 4 years ago, because we're strategically trying to address that issue. We had to address the issue of what do you do with the kid that's already got the high school attainment, and how do you push them forward? So there's a lot going on in that box, but I think from Germany, that was really helpful for me to see what they were doing. And I was very surprised initially that education was like a distant second to the vote piece. They had some nice classrooms. I didn't see any kids in school. I saw the kids at the shops. So I don't know what everybody else saw. And the other piece on the raise the age, I'm not the person that's making the policy call. There are some people in the room that are going to be much closer to the policy call than I am in Massachusetts. But I think that how I would answer that would be, I wouldn't personally advocate that the 18, 19, and 20-year-olds be in the juvenile justice or the adult system. But I think the Germany trip reinforced for me that the separation of that group would have value, because they were relaxed. The guys that I was observing, I didn't see the girls, but the guys that I was observing, they were relaxed. The interaction between the staff and the young people was very, I don't know if I should use the word therapeutic, but it was healthy. And for me, it just makes the argument that that's a different group that shouldn't be in with the 50-year-olds necessarily. I don't know that they should be in with the 15-year-olds. I think it's a big-time policy decision that's going to be made from the legislature and the governor's office. But I think the argument for me is that, yeah, it would make some sense to separate that group. It's really difficult.
So just so everybody understands the policy issue at stake here. Obviously, Commissioner Forbes has 18, 19, and 20-year-olds in his facility, but if their crimes originated after their 18th birthday, they wouldn't be able to be in that facility unless they had some whole juvenile thing where maybe they got sentenced in. But like basically, if they started their crime time at 18, then they'd have to go, if they were going to be incarcerated, to a house of corrections or prison. Whereas in Germany, that's not the case, and the judges can choose. Senator Brownsburg, who co-chairs the Joint Committee on Judiciary for the legislature in Massachusetts, did a terrific blog piece. If you folks haven't seen it, that was amazingly quickly done. I don't know, did you know? I was like, wow.
I know.
And it touched on so many of the points there. It was very good. I thought a really good summary. So I want to give you a shout out on that. And just ask you kind of just to throw it up there, like what were your major policy or even practice takeaways from the trip? What did you come back with?
Well, it was a stunningly valuable trip to be, to see right up there, and then to meet the people really, and then to be with everybody, and to have the conversations and to be thinking together about it. It was just a really special thing for us all, I think. I was, as a lawyer, just really amazed by the differences in how they do things, and the role of the judge. It was really the judge is sort of driving the bus. And the adversary system is just not what they do over there. Even in the most serious cases, the role of the prosecutors and the defense attorney is sort of almost just like supporting the work of the judge. And that kind of goes in, and they're all civil servants, or at least the prosecutors and the judges are both life-appointed civil servants. They come up through more or less the same channel. They all work for the Ministry of Justice, and and so that allows the creation of what I think is the most striking thing that I took away which was this real cultural focus on rehabilitation. And everybody was just really passionate about, how do we help kids, or how do we help young people? And they would talk about each case, like what exactly is what we're going to do, that considering this individual's unique needs, what are we going to do that's going to help them get back on track? And that was the orientation of the prosecutors, the orientation of the judges, the orientation of the correctional officers, the sort of presentation by the correctional officers and the leaders of the correctional system about their orientation to rehabilitation. We are here for human rights. We are here. It's a pitch you don't get from leadership of most correctional institutions here. And not to say they don't care about the issues, but there's just much more of a security focus. So the depth of that cultural commitment to rehabilitation is very impressive. A culture is something that's different in different parts of the animal. There's a zeitgeist, but there's a zeitgeist here and a zeitgeist there. In DYS now we have a wonderful zeitgeist of rehabilitation. It's the culture of rehabilitation.
You practicing your German on us now?
I love the word. I love culture is almost sort of a slightly politically incorrect word, but we could use the word culture of rehabilitation. Maybe it's a better word. That's been created, under Peter's leadership and under the leadership of Ed Dolan previously and over the past couple of decades. It really wasn't that way, 20, 30 years ago. It was not such a great place. So we wouldn't be talking about raising, if those of us who are concerned about rehabilitation would not be talking about raising the age and putting more kids into DYS if DYS is what it was some years ago. So, where do you draw the lines? How do you move the boxes around? I think there's a whole lot of possibilities as to how we can improve our focus on rehabilitating young adults. And youth, I guess the way I'm sort of starting to think about it is youth is, as compared to schizophrenia, as compared to heroin addiction, as compared to profound sociopathy, youth is a relatively curable disease. One that's actually you are going to progress out of with some kind of confidence. And so therefore, there's a reason to expect that a lot of folks can get back on the right track, and we should look at how to do that. So I think we've set in place in the criminal justice reform package. We don't have any money in there, but we do have a number of different indicators that are sort of pointing people in the right direction. And then we have a very strong commission, which includes a lot of people in this room. And I think it's a commitment that's it's a commission that's going to come out with a lot of momentum, and I think shine a bright light on the question of just what can we do in this area. And I'm hopeful that we'll find the right path to make some good changes.
And other states are starting to step into this space, but I think with the commission here, Massachusetts, the Commonwealth will be at the lead on that. I think not only will that affect your public policy, I think people around the country are going to be reading whatever that commission comes out with.
Yeah.
Representative Khan was also on the trip, and I'd like to offer you up the same sort of opportunity, just sort of say what you took away. But I specifically remember you remarking on the mother's facility in Auschwitz. If you want to say anything about that, Harry just did, but I'll give you your shot at it too.
I didn't realize we were going to have to say a few things.
I'm going to ask you to sing a song too.
So again, as Brown Sugar mentioned, Will mentioned that it was an extraordinary trip. It was an extraordinary group, and we all, I think, gained so much in coming at it from different perspectives. So I would just say that, so I'm also a psychiatric nurse. So I was also looking at the social services piece and the psychiatric mental health issues. And I guess I was struck by the fact that social services was really important. It played an important role, I think, in all of the work that was being done for young people that had come into the system. And I felt like it was more respect somehow for social services than I feel like we have here. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the probation officers were all social workers. And so I was struck by the fact that there was a lot of teamwork. I felt that there was just people working together as a team, particularly when we were up in the northern section of Germany in the smaller community areas. There was just a real sense of commitment to work together as a team And I think the social services played a really big piece in all of that. And I think we were all struck by the trial that we had the opportunity to witness with the young person. And it was the probation officer, who was a social worker, who had looked through this person's history and what he was coming to this situation with. And they looked at really what he had, the strengths that he had. And there's a lot of talk about strengths that people had. And in this particular case, there was the strength of the fact that he had a girlfriend, and it was kind of steady and had steadied him a bit. And he had potentially, apparently, had stopped drinking, and that he was about to be employed. And so they looked at they took all of that into consideration. Again, it was considered a minor crime. They had made that decision before they went into the trial. But I think it was impressive, at least to me, and I think some of the others, that it was really, the social services played a role.
It did involve a pretty real-looking gun, though, didn't it?
They did, yeah. I mean, this person had.
When they pulled that gun, I was like, whoa.
Right,
that was a
exactly.
gun.
And this person had pulled out a gun on New Year's Eve in the subway and pointed it at a young woman who was getting on the subway. And I think there must have been, and I can't remember, it was all in German, so we had to take bits and pieces, but the fact, I think people must have come to him right away and taken him away. And, but at the trial, the woman who was the victim was there, that she came in and she sat, and initially he sort of denied that he said he couldn't remember anything, and then the judge pulled out the gun, and reminded him, and we were all like, oh my God, it did look like a real gun. And, but I think that he then kind of backed down, and he ended up apologizing to the young woman. And what was interesting is that instead of, I think the judge, as I understand it, wanted to lock him up for like 4 weeks. But then he kind of looked at these, they looked at, I think, their folks with some sense of, what they were coming from. This young man had been picked up before. It wasn't the first time, but he apparently came from an unstable sort of home life. And they felt that he was really moving forward. So they really took a look at what was better for society. To lock him up for 4 weeks, which I don't think would have really done much, but they felt it was better to get him on his way and get him into his employment. And they also said he didn't have to report to the employer, but that he had been in court. And so that was also, I think, new for us, because we struggle with that a little bit here in Massachusetts. At least, how much do we need to report? How much do they need to report? But all in all, I think it was just an extraordinary opportunity to compare what we do here. So for those of you who don't know, I'm the House Chair of the Committee on Children, Families, and Persons with Disabilities. So we look a lot at young people and what we can do to protect them and to help them move along, and work very closely with the Department of Youth Services, with the courts. We just work with everybody and try to do the best for kids. So I've been a big proponent of raising the age, and I really I'm very impressed with what DYS does. I think over the years I've had an opportunity to visit some of the programs, and I think the education piece, and I agree. To me, that's really key. And we actually got a little bit of money in the budget to work on post-secondary education. There's a lot of that going on here in Massachusetts and around the country, in fact. We have all the colleges, Boston University, MIT, Harvard, Emerson College. They're all working on going into the prison system and working with the prisoners around getting a secondary education for those who can do it. And I think it would be great to be able to, connect with the community colleges here and because we know that, through the research that there's under 3% recidivism for people who are coming out of the school, out of the prison with a college degree. As far as the women, so I've always had a big, strong interest in women and keeping women connected with their children. And that's something that I've worked on for many, many years. And I have to say, I'm really pleased with the Department of Corrections. They've kind of stepped up, because I introduced the idea of having a summer camp for the kids. So Secretary Bennett was very interested, and he stepped up and So we're going into our third summer now, where there are, like, I think we started out with 2 Saturdays in July, we went to 4 Saturdays last year, and this summer we're coming up with several in the summer, and then also a lot of the mothers requested if they could do something around the holidays. So we're moving along with that, which is really great. It's been a wonderful experience, and so it was good to go to one of the places that we visited, one of the prisons where they did have a mother baby program, and they only take 2 at a time, but the mothers can keep their babies with them, and then if they're a little older, they go off during the day to a daycare program or preschool. And so I think people were very intrigued by that and interested, and of course I feel like we've been wanting to do that for a long time, so I was excited to see it, that they certainly seem to be interested. So the one area that I feel like I didn't come away with enough knowledge about was the mental health piece. And that I feel like we weren't able to kind of get to that. And so it's hard to know. I think, they didn't seem to want to, they kept saying, oh, they're someplace else. So I don't know what that means. And, they didn't, so I think if there were mental health issues, very kind of low level, I think in terms of what we actually saw. So I'm ready to take another trip to examine the mental health piece. But really, it was extraordinary, and I have to thank the Columbia University Justice Lab for inviting us to come, and really enjoyed getting to know all of my colleagues. So thank you.
That's great, thank you. District Attorney Marion Ryan, Middlesex District Attorney. Other than getting rid of those pesky defense attorneys at trials, took away from the trip that you want to tell us about?
So I really, echo what you've heard about, how wonderful the trip was. I am grateful to Columbia for that opportunity. I certainly learned as much from the folks that I went with and their reaction to things as I did from what I saw. A few things that really struck me were, first of all, the due process piece. It was a little jarring to see the defendant sitting at trial, the juvenile sitting at trial with no one there with him. Also interesting about their concept sort of jurors. The jurors, if you will, when they use them, are really sort of professional civilians who, there are 2 of them with a judge, and they act for 5 years? I think it was 5 years that they kind of get appointed. You sort of get appointed as a professional juror, and you serve for 5 years. So there'd be a panel of 3, 2 of these jurors and a judge when that happened. So that was all very different, that piece of it. I was really struck at the institution by what we learned about what is really embedded in the German Constitution, which is the idea that taking someone's liberty away is the punishment. And once you have taken their liberty away, there is to be no further shaming or punishment. So people are to be treated once they are in custody, so now they've been punished, in the way that you would treat anyone else. So for instance, there were outward and I think inward signs of that. One of the outward signs was all of the cells had completely sealed steel doors. So no one could see into the cell. There were no little peepholes, there were no little windows, nothing like that, because that was a privacy and dignity issue. So as you walked through, first of all, it was very quiet, kind of isolating in a way, because the other side of that, which I thought was interesting, was the prisoners were allowed very little contact with outsiders. So the visiting schedule was certainly much, much more limited than the amount of visiting that we allow here. They might be allowed 2 visits a month or something like that in very prescribed timeframes. But the individual piece of it, they were pretty much, especially at some parts of the prisons, wearing their own clothes. They were allowed, as you saw in a few of those pictures, they're allowed to really decorate their rooms. They look like what many of us are paying $60,000 for, exactly like a college dorm room. Lots of pictures, curtains, beds, bedspreads, all of that. I will say the one safety issue that was terrifying to me was everybody smoked everywhere. And so you had
kids.
Everybody,
Yeah.
everybody. You had these rooms with curtains and bedspreads and all these things and doors that were sealed and people smoking in there. So I have to say that did sort of raise that whole pyrotechnic piece of fear. But, so that piece was different. The other thing I think is, as we, as prosecutors especially, look towards how do you reduce recidivism and how do we really make people better going back. The 2 very striking pieces were, one you've heard a little bit about, was the job training. And in Germany in general, for everyone, they pride themselves on being craftsmen. So anybody who wants to be some kind of a professional, whether it's a bike mechanic, because as we saw, everybody rode bikes everywhere, so that's a job. Welders, glass makers, whatever it is. If you are in custody or not, you have to do a 3-year apprenticeship program. So you are while you're in there, you can be in that program. And since most people don't serve 3 years, you're not going to finish it in there. But you leave at year 2 or wherever you are, and you are able to transition right into that same program outside. Pick up and finish your 3 years. And you know, that I cannot help but believe that that is a significant feature in the fact that there is no recidivism, because they're going right back out and they get jobs and there's virtually no unemployment. So obviously you have money coming in, you're able to do many, many other things. The other piece was that there really is very little criminal record history. So essentially, consistent with that idea that we've taken your liberty away and we've punished you, their thought is, you've now served your time, we're finished with you, goodbye. And at some point when we asked them something about who knows about this record, they said, well, you couldn't really reestablish yourself if you had a record. So you leave and it's all sort of forgotten. And you go into the work program and all of that, and you can say, I'm at year 2 of this training program, but not I did my 2 years at the prison. Nobody is concerned about that piece. And so, of course, it raises, and this to me was very interesting, in terms of a cultural shift. So if you have people who come out with all kinds of offenses, sometimes sexual offenses or whatever it is, and we're really not tracking any of that, and people are getting sentences that are relatively small, regardless of what the crime is. I mean, for most crimes other than homicide, it would be extraordinary for somebody to get a sentence more than 3 years. So one of the questions we asked about was, what's the public reaction to that? Because there must be some people who serve some sentence and come out and bad things happen. And then how do people react to that? And they talked of a very different public view, which is, well, people have done the best they could. They tried for rehabilitation to this, and essentially there is sometimes a cost to these things. More than a sort of finger pointing kind of thing that we might see of how did this happen, why were they out, why didn't we know about that record? Which makes me think, you know, as Chief Justice Carey said, this is a long process, because this is certainly something that has developed across the country. This wasn't just about the correctional facilities. The idea that people really put so much trust into the court system. For instance, they told us that victims rarely participate because they essentially believe that the court will take care of it and they'll do the right thing for them. And that unless they were going to be getting restitution, dollar restitution, they really weren't usually involved in the process. So that piece was different, as well as sort of the whole direction, and reflected in the amount of training that they give their corrections officers. You know, 2 years of pretty intensive training, a lot focused on the rehabilitation. So that's a resource question that obviously is a bigger societal picture. But it was an amazing trip. Really made me as well come back and think about how could we incorporate, in the system we have now, how could we incorporate some of those changes? So thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So in addition to the prosecution side of the aisle, we had the defense side of the aisle. We had Anthony Benedetti and Josh Doan. Anthony's the head of CPCS, the Public Defender Service for the Commonwealth. Josh is the head juvenile defender. And just so you know, it was a fair fight. We also had Dave Sullivan, another prosecutor, so it was 2-on-2, it wasn't 1-2, from Western Mass Davis. Anthony, we saw a young woman yesterday at the facility, at Peters facility, talk about how she's now a nurse's aide coming out of juvenile court and juvenile justice. And she mentioned that this part of the way she was able to be a nurse's aide is that she had a confidential record. It wasn't public, and that allowed her to get her certificate. And then District Attorney Ryan mentioned the confidentiality issues and how that plays out. So I'm wondering, I know we discussed the sort of collateral consequences of an adult conviction versus a juvenile conviction. I'd like you to address that in your comments, but also, is there anything else you want to sort of mention about the trip?
Sure. Well, I would echo what you've already heard. It was an incredible opportunity getting to go to Germany and learn about some of the great things they are doing there. Spending time with colleagues who are working throughout the system. To follow up on one thing that the sheriff said when he talked about, we had time to talk a little bit about the things we heard and the things we saw. And to give you a little bit of a sense of what he meant by that is we didn't have a ton of free time. We were driving a lot of distances. And
Leo made sure of that.
and so we were on long bus rides. And so there were conversations, there were debates where Vinny and Leo would throw questions at us, and you would get opinions from everyone on the bus about what their reaction was to what they saw and how they thought it might be able to be brought back to the things we're doing here. And so there was one thing that's, I'll get to Vinny's question, but there was one thing that struck me. You've heard a little bit about this trial, and there was not a defense attorney, so I can tell you as a defense attorney, my instinct was to jump up and defend this case. It's just so different from everything we experience here in the United States. But when we all sat down and this young man walked into the courtroom, and there was this young woman that came in with him. And later I learned that others felt the same way. I thought it was his girlfriend. It turns out it was the victim. And so they walk into the courtroom, and he has a seat at a table like we have our courtrooms here. And she was a little bit off to the side, I think. And so we had some translation, as Chief Justice Carey said, it was kind of ad hoc, where there were the people that were with us, and they were trying to tell us what was going on and what was being said. And so you're watching this process, and to me, it really seemed almost like a restorative justice process taking place. The judge was the one doing most of the talking, and he engaged her, and he was asking her opinion. And I think what we got was he was trying to get a sense of, from her, what happened, but also what did she want to see happen. I think, if my memory serves me, is that he was looking to have this young man pay some fines or fees to her directly, some sort of restitution. I think she said no. She said no, right. And so then she leaves. And so we had conversation about that, what our thoughts about that were on the bus, and I can tell you there was definitely a difference of opinion. Understandably, there was those of us who felt like that seemed to be restorative justice in action, and from our perspective, albeit limited, it seemed to work. She walked out smiling. Who knows what she was really thinking? And then there was the other perspective, which felt she was a victim, that really wasn't an appropriate, they quite frankly didn't agree with what we all thought was happening. And so, but it was a great conversation. It was an opportunity to really talk through what we were witnessing, and is that something that we could ever, a place we could ever get to here in the United States. But getting back to Vinny's question, I can say I've been to, we had the opportunity to go to the Middleton facility yesterday, and I've been to the Dorchester facility. And a lot of what I saw in the DYS facilities, quite frankly, was similar to what we saw in Germany. And specifically what I mean is the staff and the relationship with the staff and the young people in the facilities. And there just seemed to be some level of mutual respect. We heard from 3 people yesterday, and they were honest about their experiences. We asked them what was the worst thing about the facility and what would they change, and they were honest with us. They didn't seem to have any problem telling us. But what this young woman told us was she had received, she was very proud of it, she had received her certified nursing assistant degree, and she was talking about how she was going to be able to go out and not be burdened by a criminal record. And that brought memories back of what we experienced in Berlin and Rostock, where it was all about lifting, to borrow Senator Brownsburg, a phrase that he's been using a lot, lifting people up. the staff that we had an opportunity to talk to in Germany were all about recognizing these kids are not going to be locked up forever, and we need to make sure that they're able to succeed when they get back out into the community. And that's definitely what I experienced in hearing all three of these young people yesterday in the DYS facility. Going to Germany, I was already in favor of raising the age. And after this experience, I'm even more in favor of it, because you see the advantages of treating these young adults differently than you treat older adults, where it is all about not having a criminal record to burden them when they get out and they're trying to move on with their life. They're trying to get jobs, they're trying to get housing, they're trying to do the right thing. And so I think we have a lot to learn about how they treat young adults, and I think we are doing a lot of great things right now with DYS, and there's a lot of room for expansion. So
Thank you, Anthony.
thank you.
Steve, did you, Sheriff Tompkins, did you, we left the first name thing in German.
Yeah, just real quick, several of my colleagues have referenced this trial that we attended, and it was a great experience for all the reasons that was just mentioned. But one of my takeaways was this, frankly. The young man in question with the pop gun had done the same type of thing before. This wasn't the first time that he'd done this. And in my mind, standing there listening to him and listening to the judge and the prosecutor and the woman who was off to the side, that was like, I think, a caseworker that was assigned to him, juxtaposed to the facility that we went to in Rostov, where there were more olive and brown skinned individuals than white individuals. And I'm looking at this white young man, and I'm listening to what the judge, well, translated, the penalty that was going to be meted out for him. And the thing that just popped into my mind was, if this was a black kid, would it have been as easy for them just to say, okay, you were bad, little slap on the backside and have a good day, And so when you talk about comparing that system to our system, although there is more compassion, I do believe, as has been mentioned by several of us, I also go back to the nature of who's in jail. And it's the same here as it was there, that you've got darker skin, so-called minorities in prison. And so I just thought that, and hopefully I would be wrong, but I just thought if that was a black boy, black man, whatever, he may have been on his way to jail, particularly because he had done this before. If this was the first time this guy had done that, well, okay, maybe. But he'd done it 2 or 3 times prior with a gun, and,
So we got 3 more participants in the audience and about 12 minutes left. So I'm going to offer Josh Dolan, Greg Fateau from UTEC, and Yotam Zera from Roca an opportunity to say something, and we'll go to the audience. And you can turn that opportunity down or take it. But make it quick. With the Bar Association, so you guys roll here.
I'd like to build a little bit on something that the senator, the DA, and the commissioner talked about, which is where we are in relation to Germany and what it would take for us to get closer to what they have in Germany. And so, as somebody who for the last 30 years has been in and out of juvenile courts and adult courts and DYS and adult prisons,
and you're adjusting well, though, you do.
When we were in the youth prisons in Germany, I felt like I was listening to DYS people.
Yeah.
It's the same culture, but they have more resources, and the biggest thing I think Peter references is the vocational ed, but it's in the facility, but then also when people get out, where they are going to continue the education, they're going to get a job, they're going to have a place to live. And DYS has that mindset, and they're doing that with even the young adults. We don't have that on the adult side at all. So every kid that goes to DYS gets out and is in a transition before their sentence is over. almost no adult prisoners do. It's just the change that it would take for the Department of Corrections and for parole to get anywhere near what people are actively trying to do on the juvenile side is just such a major shift, a major mindset shift, colossal collective bargaining with all the unions that are involved. Right now, even the progressive sheriffs, like Sheriff Tompkins, fund their programs through surcharges on prisoners. So the most regressive tax that you can think of, but otherwise, they have no money for programs. So, then you look at what happens in the court. Juvenile court has judges who are steeped in this stuff about how to work with young people, and they see them from infancy. So they get what the issues are, they get the developmental aspect. When you get into adult court, not that I think our adult court judges have, are badly intended at all, they don't know. They don't come from this perspective. It's a very retribution-focused approach. They don't know anything about ACEs or what goes on with kids in the child welfare system. They don't understand how DYS works. And they're not thinking about how do we help this person succeed. They're just thinking about what's the right punishment. So I was somebody who, when we started the whole emerging adult thing in Massachusetts, I was really, hey, you can do it on the adult side, you can do it on the juvenile side. Totally not there anymore. It would take us 1,000,000 years to move our adult system to where our juvenile justice system is right now. And they already know how to work with that young adult population.
Gregory, you talk?
So I think District Attorney Ryan mentioned it, just to echo it. It was really interesting to see when the Minister of Justice presented one of the first slides. It was the point of.
Hey, Greg. Just so you know, this is live stream. We should have probably said that earlier. So if you want to be a voice on the side, you can be. I don't know.
No.
Hi, everybody.
It's not awkward.
You didn't want me on the line.
That was Josh Dolan. He nailed it. He crushed it.
Actually, we pressed you for it.
But District Attorney Ryan had mentioned this. One of the first slides the Minister of Justice led with was this idea of, being loss of liberty is, punishment in of itself. And that stood out to me, similarly, I think, for all of us, because it also justified when you walked in there. I think a lot of folks who walk into the prison, I believe an environment dictates behavior. Right? You walk into any organization, so when you walk into the dining hall and you see it, with all these resources, or the wood shop with all these resources, you're like, well, some folks, why are we investing in this? But if it all goes back to the fact that rehabilitation is really the #1 issue, that premise that's in the actual, I think, the penal law really justifies that. So that stood out to me. I think what also stood out was the collaboration between those groups who are doing reentry work and probation. So you had probation officers that there was a really, really tight kind of connection in the handoff. So probation officers prior to the release would work behind the walls in the prison systems and continue that as well. So a lot of other things too, but it was all fun.
So thank you. I think that was a terrific learning experience. For me, I think what stood out is one thing is just amazing to see what happens when a system is really designed looking into this with young people, and not only capping it at 18, really capping at 25. And really thinking, okay, we have young people here. So what are we going to do with them next? So when we're thinking about the next victims, when we're thinking about the fact that they're all going to be our neighbors pretty soon, they're not going to be in these facilities for so long. They're going to be here only for a few months. The same thing as the House of Corrections. The average length of stay is about 6 or 9 months in most of for this population in Massachusetts. So really, when the systems think, oh, we actually have them here for so short, what do we want to do to support them next is really interesting. The other thing that which I found fascinating is the impact of having this conversation about development, about growth, about future. Again, not to stop at 18, but at 25, how that changes the whole culture. Because now suddenly you don't have that many 15 and 16 years old in any correctional facilities because they found solutions in the community, and solutions are more effective. You have judges who have the authority to choose between adult and juvenile sanctions, and they keep choosing the juvenile sanctions because they see better outcomes. And you walk into the youth prisons there, and people really can kind of think about 20-year-olds and 16-year-olds as, yes, they can live in the same place with, with the right attention. There's something I think really transforms the way we think about adolescence, about growth, and about how we not only identify that this is a population we want to do something right with and really, push them forward, we actually have the tools, the systems in place, and really give people the ability to do that. And I think I'm a little bit with Josh. I think that for a lot of the agencies in Massachusetts that are dealing with people over age 18, doing this cultural shift is a heavy lift. And we're very much engaged in this. We work very closely with a lot of the units and the agencies that are trying to do more solutions for young adults in their facilities now, and they will share with you that this is a very heavy lift for them, and they're interested in doing this, but it's hard. So I think we need to think about how we keep supporting them in their very courageous effort to do something different in the adult system, and also how we use all the amazing changes and assets that we have here in the Commonwealth, including the juvenile court, including DYS, including services that are designed for people, for young people, and kind of give them to the population where we identify now that is kind of the very vague border between adolescence and adulthood. So thank you.
Thanks, okay. So Elizabeth Clark is here from Illinois, the Juvenile Justice Initiative of Illinois. She's going to try to set up a similar tour for legislators and key stakeholders in Illinois, and where there is actually legislation to raise the age to 21 for misdemeanors. Right now, young people charged with misdemeanors. Bets, I wonder if you wanted to sort of tell us where Illinois is at a little bit, and kind of what you take away from this conversation that might be relevant beyond our borders.
First of all, this
Again,
is
remember there's a thing if you want to be on the thing. You could be like Josh, a voiceless.
Thank you. This is so inspirational. Thank you for sharing this. I think there's great power in just seeing the vision. Back when we were trying to change our juvenile prisons, we had trips to the Missouri model, and it was transformative, and people are still going there. Now, I know Germany is a little bit further, but wherever you go to get the vision, it's just so transformative. We have a judge who recently went to Northern Ireland and has started a restorative justice court for young adults based on that visit. You are paving the way. I hope we'll be able to follow before the end of the year. I'm just very grateful. Thank you for sharing all that you saw. Thank you.
Other questions or comments from folks in the audience? We have a few minutes. Yeah, Tony.
My name is Tony DeMarco. I'm an attorney who's practiced in the juvenile field for a number of years, both child welfare, special education, and delinquency. And my caseload, while getting smaller, has sort of, in the last few years, developed into 18 to 21-year-olds, what the courts call PYA, which is permanency youth to adulthood. And that category of cases comes from the child welfare system that has failed in permanency, with the kids who come out of the child welfare system. Those are 18 to 22. The federal government has given the Department of Children and Families extra money to care for these kids and provide services. 70% of these kids who come out of the child welfare system and become adults at 18 end up homeless at some point. 70% of the boys end up in jail at some point. I have 6 of those cases. I have personally appeared before district court judges who glaze over when I tell them I'm a PYA attorney. They haven't got the concept. And probation in the district court has no idea what this is all about. I've appeared before district court judges, with Department of Mental Health workers, with child welfare workers, with UTEC workers right beside me. And I've said to them, we've got programs. And the district court judges, Bellricker, Middleton, continually. I see the district court as not helpful. I have not seen prosecutors as helpful at all in looking at how do we address issues down the line for these kids who are 18 to 21.
Judge, do you want Make a comment, or does anybody want to make a comment or respond?
Thank you for telling us that. I think that's a subset that perhaps we need to pay more attention to. You look at the data for not this population, but if you look at, I have data of district court and BMC 18 to 21, and the vast majority, in fact, it's close to 80%, actually get a quaff or probation. Those are the results. So it's a very small subset that actually end up serving any time, or to not guilty. So there's a small subset, but I'm not sure that we've ever actually taken the time to take a look at that population, which is a little bit different than the average defendant that might come in this age group, because I would say that they probably had extraordinary challenges that brought them to that level that should be taken into consideration. I know we've talked with the district court and the BMC about doing some additional training in this particular area for this age group. I certainly will bring it back to my district court and BMC chiefs, your comments, and so it may bring it to a head. Because, and even if looking at the raise the age legislation that we have here, I'm not sure that there's a magic number. So I'm not sure, I think people should be dealt with individually. And so if they're 25, there's some 25-year-olds that may have grown out of it, and there's some 25-year-olds that are really 16 or 18, depending upon how, so we should be looking at these individuals as individuals. And looking at how they came to the system, what brought them there. So thank you for your comment.
Last question, yes.
Yes, so I'm Rebecca Priest, and I'm with the Massachusetts Alliance of Juvenile Court Clinics, and this is fascinating and inspiring. I want to be especially thankful to Rep. Khan for having represented the mental health part of this trip. I recently had, thanks to Lael, the opportunity to visit the emerging adult court in San Francisco. So you might want, I'm totally envious of all of you who went to Germany.
That's really why we did this today, so.
But you might schedule another trip to San Francisco. It's also a great place to visit. And I would.
There's a great court in Cleveland too.
Maybe not quite as much fun, but cheaper airfare. But what I wanted to say about my experience was witnessing the judge interacting with the young people, the way that they had the capacity to integrate social services, vocational services, which were key, homelessness, the housing issues, and mental health issues, all as a part of the package. I just say go visit. Meet Kate Miller and see the team, and that's also information we can bring back to Massachusetts to make use of.
Yeah, I visited that court, and Roca had George Gascon come out and speak at their breakfast and then present to a bunch of stakeholders here. It's everything you say it is. I'm very impressed. I know you're dying to get in, so you want to. And this will be the last comment because
if people on the trip or somebody could talk a little bit about the outcomes, what are recidivism rates? DA Ryan alluded to there being virtually no recidivism, but I'd love to hear a little more concretely what they found there. And also, this may be going too far, how that compares to adult rates. In other words, is there just kind of secularly less recidivism there, or can you really attribute what they're doing with this youth population, very good outcomes?
I would say there was not a lot of clear evidence about what the recidivism rates were. We asked about that a lot. There was some information about certain pockets and what the recidivism rates were. So I certainly left without a very clear idea of what the recidivism rates were across the board. And keeping in mind that whatever they were talking about did not include people who suffered from any great level of mental illness, who seemed not to be in that population. And also taking out that they really do not have any significant drug-dependent population. So they wouldn't have been, they just aren't there. So they were not as clear as one might have hoped about what the recidivism numbers were.
They kind of, like we lead with that, they kind of don't lead with that. They kind of lead with human rights approaches to this, that these are a group of young people that we need to care about, we need to turn their lives around, we're gonna help them as much as we can, and they really weren't focused quite as much on that as we do. I will say, we went to Middleton yesterday, right? Middleton yesterday, and they have this YES program where kids can voluntarily stay on their caseloads and receive support from DYS, which is let's just kind of wrap our arms around how stunning it is that a kid would voluntarily stay involved with the juvenile justice system past the point where they have to. I think that speaks volumes, but also, and it's not a random assignment, and maybe it's a better group of kids that volunteer to stick around than the kids that don't, so let's just sort of own that. But they get re-convicted of crimes at significantly lower rates than the kids that don't volunteer to stick around. So I don't know that speaks to, okay, so therefore we should raise the age, but it beats a poke in the eye in the absence of data. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting. You heard from Chief Justice Carey about the young man who got convicted for stomping on his grandmother, got 6-7 years. It was the prosecutor who told us that story. And the prosecutor did it in a way that seemed to me like he was trying to be provocative. He knew he was going to get a reaction, and he did. I have to admit, even I had a reaction, because you're part of a system, you have norms, and so when he said the maximum sentence is 10, I assumed the sentence was going to be 10, it was 7 years. And he went on to say how this kid messed up a couple times, and they had to, I can't remember if they revoked his parole, but it was all about, we are going to stick with this kid because this kid eventually is going to get out, and we want to do everything we can to make him a productive citizen. And so I think we're a long way from getting to a maximum of 10 years, but the fact that it was the prosecutor who was telling us that story and doing it in a way that was provocative, and he was there ready to defend that sentence and to defend the way they approach those kinds of crimes. It was fascinating.
Well, I thank the panel and all the participants.
And there's some refreshments if people want to grab something to eat. Please.